asked to talk about the global war on terrorism and its successes in Afghanistan and Pakistan, although I should begin with a preface that with the new administration, we may not be using the word global war on terrorism anymore. But since this was written before that was made clear, I still have that vernacular in the paper. Comparing the successes and failures in these two theaters are, of course, very difficult because, in fact, we're doing very different things. So it's a little bit like comparing broccoli and oranges. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the United States, working with NATO and its Afghan partners, they're engaging in a counterinsurgency campaign, a counterterrorism campaign, and working with the United Nations are trying to rebuild a country that has basically endured nearly 4 decades of violence and conflict. In Pakistan, we're not waging a counterinsurgency campaign overtly, although one could suggest that we are doing so covertly given some of the things that are happening in Fatah. But in Pakistan, our goals are really to persuade, mostly through substantial allurements, Pakistani cooperation in the war on terrorism. Other goals such as stability, democracy, non-proliferation, complete cessation of all support and/or redoubled efforts to eliminate all militant groups based in and operating from the country. These other goals have come up in different years across the last 7 years of engaging Pakistan, and depending on the requirement in any given year, they've been subordinated to the other objectives in Afghanistan. So I wanted to say up front that this exercise of looking at success and failures in both theaters, it's not exactly a comparable exercise, and so some of the things I'm going to draw out for both theaters are going to be very different. So first, turning to Afghanistan, after the completion of the bond process, reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan are supposed to be tracking the Afghanistan Compact, which identified 3 pillars of activity in which the international community are supposed to be engaging in. Security is one, of course, and quite frankly, the preeminent one. Governance, rule of law, and human rights is the second. Social and economic development's the third. And then there were a number of cross-cutting themes, including counter-narcotics, that were identified. If you look at the activities that are actually going on in Afghanistan, the vast majority of the resources and attention is paid to the first, security. And the reasons for that are somewhat straightforward. Afghanistan has been beset by a complex adaptive system of threats, to use the terminology of my colleague Seth Jones. And I think it's actually useful to tweeze out what is this system of threats, because I think all too often in fora we tend to think of there being a relatively monolithic threat in Afghanistan. And in fact, there are at least 5 different clusters of actors who, along different fronts, recombine and present very specific kinds of threats that need very specific responses. The first cluster is, of course, the insurgents, which we can roughly say is comprised of the Taliban and allied fighters, for example, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Jalaluddin Haqqani, Al-Qaeda, and a number of the so-called Pakistan-based groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is also operating in Afghanistan. A second set of actors will include criminal operators, and so this would obviously include those that are trafficking in narcotics, but also timber and gems, which is very common in Afghanistan. A third kind of actors include different sorts of tribal actors. And the fourth includes warlords and militias, many of whom have become empowered after the overthrow of the Taliban. And the fifth category is comprised of, may I say so bluntly, corrupt government officials in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and all the other countries in its near and far periphery. And so if you look at the way in which these different actors mobilize along different threats, you actually see different sets of actors along different fronts. So, for example, in Helmand, in that south, you see your traditional Taliban under Mullah Omar, obviously operating with tribal actors. There's also a lot of collaboration with narcotics traffickers. When you're moving this way along the border and you're right across the street from Fatah, you see Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, you will see Baytullah Masood of the Pakistani Taliban. As you go farther north to Kunar and Nuristan, you begin seeing the introduction of Al-Qaeda and Lashkar-e-Taiba, as well as gem and timber smugglers. So it's not a monolithic threat that's problematizing the country. In fact, it's a very interesting mosaic of threats that are operating in very specific parts of the country. But suffice it to say, neither the national nor the international forces that have been mobilized thus far have been adequate to deal with these threats. So the areas that I'm going to focus upon in my presentation are really going to first look at the efforts for so-called security sector reforms. And the justification for that is where the bulk of the resources have gone. In fact, it's, as I'll comment later on, it's really quite a problem that this is where all the resources have gone. But the counterinsurgency literature is very clear that foreign forces can't beat insurgents. It requires local forces. And for this reason, and then also given the relatively light footprint that the international forces have used, there's a tremendous interest in generating robust Afghan police and Afghan army, and I'm just going to call it Afghan Security Forces, ANSF, from here out. But what's very interesting, when you look at the size of the forces that are being built, it really serves the international needs and not those that are over the long term, perhaps best in the interest of Afghanistan. In fact, some of the things that the U.S. has done is actually contradicted commitments that have been forged through the UN and even comments explicitly made by Karzai. So, for example, in 2002, Karzai was pretty clear that he wanted the armed forces to be capped at 70,000. Compare that to the recent numbers announced by Secretary of Defense Gates for 122,000. We saw a very similar creep in forces in the police. The U.S. prefers that the Afghan police forces should total 82,000. Now, even before these announced expansions in force sizes, it is really important to note that both the military and police trainers were inadequate both in numbers and in quantity. So it really is a policy conundrum with the paucity of trainers that the U.S. and the international community has been able to put forward, how we're going to create the forces of these sizes and in the quality that's needed in the time horizon that is needed. As has already been discussed this morning, one of the issues with this force structure that's being built is that it's fiscally unsustainable. Right now, the United States and its partners, but mostly the U.S., bankrolls the entire production and maintenance of the Afghan security forces. Why is this a problem? Well, in the political science literature, this is called a rentier state. And rentier states in the literature are shown to be not successful states. The reason for that is very simple, is that one of the essential bonds of a government between the government and those that it governs is that it extracts resources and it redistributes services. Now, Afghanistan has always been a rentier state in some measure. Going back to the 19th century, about 40% of its military expenses were subsidized by the British. But if you look at the successive decades and the successive periods of Afghan government and regimes that have come along, it has become ever more a rentier state. This is another problem because this also undermines the central premise of our efforts, is that we want to have a stable government in Kabul that enjoys the legitimacy of its people. Yet when Kabul depends upon the United States to write the check for very basic things like security, how is this to generate a sense of confidence that the government is anything but a proxy? So in the big picture, rentier states are in general not a good thing, and it certainly undermines what we're trying to do there. And this certainly is justified why Ahmed Rashid and Barnett Rubin have argued for a complete restructuring of the Afghan security forces being built. Needless to say, you can't make these two ends meet. And so you find, the United States, the British, have put forward different arming militia programs. Last year, the British put forward the Arbaki. We've got a program going on in Wardak. The idea is to arm militias to provide local security. This is as if Afghanistan needs more armed militias. Suffice it to say that this undermines dramatically the DDR effort that had so much consensus across the international community and amongst Afghan stakeholders themselves. So a final comment before I leave my comments about security sector reform. There's another structural problem. And let me just give you the example of police training. So a lot of resources have gone into training and building Afghan police. Very few comparable resources have gone into the Ministry of Justice. So at the province and certainly at the district level, you don't have functioning courts, you don't have attorneys general. The elemental items that you need to have a functioning Ministry of Justice simply don't exist. Similarly, too little attention has been paid to the Ministry of Interior, which is absolutely riven with corruption. It's intimately involved with all sorts of illicit activities. So you make a clean police officer and you put him back in a dirty Ministry of Interior, what do? You get a dirty cop again. So without thinking about providing police in a larger framework of rule of law, these efforts are going to be definitionally stillborn at the outset. The second point that I was going to talk about is counter narcotics, but that's been covered. I do want to make a few points to emphasize them. There have been, in this last year, if you read the UNODC report, successes. A number of provinces have become poppy-free. But I do want to point out the reasons for that is because of hashish substitution. Hashish requires fewer inputs, and actually it's a higher net profiting plant. And then obviously the food crisis made food much more favorable in terms of the price point than poppy was, given the conditions locally in some of the regions. So yes, there were indeed some declines, but they were probably not entirely driven by leadership. And then there are a number of challenges. I'm not going to rehash some of the ones that we heard from this morning, but I want to bring your attention to, this is a political will issue. For anyone who spent time in Kabul, everyone hears the whispering about the involvement of Karzai's own family. So if you're the president of a country and you hear that your brothers are involved in narcotics trafficking and you don't do something about it, that is kind of strange. And then, as has already been touched upon, there is this important and very intractable tension between doing counter-narcotics and doing counterinsurgency. So much so that when I met with UNODC officials in Kabul in May, they were very vexed because they take a lot of heat because their narcotics prisons are empty, but they say when they do finally capture a trafficker, because that individual is usually relevant to the U.S. coin campaign, he's released. So not only is this a lack of political consensus, this is also an issue of enormous lack of political will. Very briefly, I talked about it in the paper, so I'm not going to rehearse it here. Corruption in governance. We spend so much time thinking about the police and the army, but corruption in governance in the Afghan government is absolutely critical. One should also sort of take a page from why the Taliban succeeded in doing what they did, and they provided security and they provided justice, two things that the Afghan government currently cannot provide. It is surprising how little international and U.S. efforts in particular have gone to dealing with this issue. Moving to Pakistan, Pakistan is a tough one. Pakistan is an ally in the U.S. war on terrorism. It's a very problematic ally. It's problematic for a number of reasons, both pertaining to Islamabad's decision-making, Washington's decision-making, and regional dynamics that we're all aware of. But the long and short of it is, the U.S. government has spent $11.2 billion between FY02 and FY08, and the FY09 budget request is another $1.2 billion. So we're looking at, I don't know, a little over $12 billion. And what's apparent is that after all of these investments, Pakistan is less secure, not more. And the situation in Afghanistan has become worse, not better. Now, while it's very easy, of course, to simply put the onus of this on Pakistan, I think we do have to be a little bit cognizant of how complex the dynamics are within that country. So it is true, as I think many of us would agree, that there are a number of militant groups that still enjoy some proximity to the ISI. It's also true that some groups, particularly the Dale Bundy groups, have really broken away and are kind of doing their own thing. And it makes for a very complex picture because you can't really tell where does the will end and the incapacity begin. But if you look at from 2006 onward, Pakistan begins experiencing something that it has never previously experienced, and that's suicide attacks against the military, against the Frontier Corps, against the ISI. Obviously, this is deeply ironic. So my comments, for the purposes of brevity, are not going to be very nuanced, but I want to keep in mind that Pakistan's a very complex situation, and what's going on internally is a linear combination of a lack of political will, a lack of capability, and I would argue that when you're not capable of doing something well, that's going to condition your will to even try in the first place. So with those caveats, I'm going to then move in what's going to appear to be very cut and dry language. Financial assistance gone awry, I think, will summarize how the last circa $12 billion has been allocated. There are a number of reasons for it. It's amazing how similar these mistakes have been relative to previous periods of engaging Pakistan. But if you look at where the money's gone, the vast majority of it, in one way or another, has gone to support the military, at the extreme disregard of Pakistan's civilian institutions. And as students of history of South Asia, what we know is that when the military leader inevitably recedes under varying circumstances, the civilians are less capable in governing the day after the military chap steps down than they were the day before he stepped in. And yet, with full knowledge of this fact, U.S. and its partners has really been derelict in investing in the civilian institutions. We all talk about an expanded IMET program, an International Military Educational Training Program, to reach those officers that were shut out following the 1990 invocation of the Prust Amendment sanctions. We never talk about an IMET for bureaucrats and political party representatives. It's a shameful omission of our policy. Leaving aside the vast majority of our aid's gone to the military, let's take a look at where those monies have actually gone. The vast majority, again, of those military expenditures have gone to Coalition Support Funds Program. This is not an aid program. This is nominally a reimbursement program. For those of you who are frequent readers of government accounting reports, they're very titillating, I assure you. What we see is that program has been abused. Things have been reimbursed for that may not have happened or for which there's inadequate substantiation, and they have been reimbursed on terms that are very lucrative. But the point that I'd like to draw your attention to is that CSF, a program is not intended to build capacity of the Pakistan Army. So the complaints that you see voiced in the New York Times, not my favorite publication these days, are misplaced because this was never intended to make the Pakistan Army a better counterinsurgency force. It was meant to reimburse them for their marginal costs incurred from their deployments. So a lot of our money has really not been spent in a way that would enhance capacity. And we can talk about some of the other things like the foreign military financing programs that have largely focused upon weapon systems that are strategic and not well suited for counterinsurgency that will probably come up in the Q&A. Another problem with U.S. assistance has been its philosophy. And it's not just the U.S. that does it, virtually everyone does it. It's called supply-driven assistance. If we provide it, they will take it. And this leads to what's called the Samaritan's Dilemma. So the donating country, the country with the resources, is hesitant to put requirements for transparency, for outcomes, because they're afraid that if they put these conditions on the assistance, the country will simply walk away and go to some other checkbook that has less onerous requirements. And countries want to avoid this because they fear that then they will forego the opportunity for strategic influence. Supply-driven aid, developmental economists will tell you, never works because there's never an adequate constituent in the receiving country to make the program effective. So the way we do aid is simply a problem. Another problem with the way we do aid is the actual mechanism. And again, this isn't just USAID, it's also DFID, CETA to some extent, but everyone does it the same way, especially in a complex environment like Pakistan, where there are security issues and people can't get out. We rely upon a cascade of contractors, all of whom take their cut first. So for every dollar that's spent, allegedly, from the American people to the Afghan government or to the Pakistan government, about 10 cents remain in the target country. And it varies depending upon the country and the program. So it is indeed U.S. aid, because 90 cents on every dollar is coming right back to the United States. So it's very difficult to build capacity given the modalities of aid and given the way in which aid has to be distributed. And needless to say, given the enormous security threats that are present in Pakistan, or the perceived threats, and given the American risk aversion, folks can't really go out and see the impact or lack thereof of their program. So it means that there's never going to be an honest assessment of whether or not there was, in fact, an outcome commensurate with the inputs. And this is one of my big concerns, by the way, with the Hearts and Mind spending that we heard about this morning, is that there's no empirical foundation that says money spent winning hearts and minds make them hate you less. There's simply no data that support that contention. And if you have some that I don't know about, I would love to hear it. I would say the final problem with U.S. assistance is that it largely misdiagnoses the problem. In virtually every single case that I can think of, the biggest problem has been the state's own intentions, interests, and strategic calculations. You cannot, with our current suite of programs, cajole Pakistan into doing things that it thinks are not in its interest. With our current policy approach, that is simply impossible. So I'm going to conclude with my discussion with Pakistan with two other important observations. It's also been very difficult to message to Pakistan because the U.S. has had, in fact, shifting goals. So in 2002, everyone was very interested in al-Qaeda. No one really cared much about Taliban. Everyone thought the Taliban had been vanquished. When they came back on the scene, people were very confused. And it really wasn't until 2007 that the United States began putting pressure on Pakistan about the sanctuaries vice the Taliban. And pressure on groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba has been very intermittent, if at all, and very much occasioned by particular attacks, like the Parliament attack, the Kalachuk massacre, and obviously Mumbai. And then finally, the U.S. has generally failed to develop a strategy for Pakistan. This is not an exaggeration. There has been a complete falling down in terms of trying to forge an overall interagency strategy for Pakistan that mobilizes all aspects of U.S. national power, that engages all aspects of Pakistani national power. The United States has done too little to engage other neighbors in Afghanistan, and that's why we're in this horrible situation where we're completely dependent upon one supply route. And even though Russia has said you can move non-lethal stuff through its territory, we still need to move lethal stuff through someone's territory. So these overtures that Russia's put on the table, largely I would also add through their dynamics with NATO, I don't really see getting us out of the picture. The U.S. unwillingness to engage Iran is actually quite dismaying, given that Iran did participate very productively in the Bonn process. It was Iran, oddly enough, that suggested putting the mention of democracy in the Bonn Accord. So what Iran got for thanks for that was inclusion in the Axis of Evil, which I'm glad they did, because then I got to write a cookbook about the Axis of Evil. But the problem is, as we all know, is the United States hasn't had an interagency strategy, and it hasn't had a regional strategy. And these have been debilitating in our ability to successfully engage Pakistan. So let me just conclude on a cantankerous note. Everyone says things like this: we have to stabilize Pakistan to save Afghanistan. We need to coerce Pakistan to save Afghanistan. I think this has interest completely turned on its head. By virtue of the fact that Pakistan has more people, mostly people who hate us, a large army engaged in an active security competition with a nuclear-armed neighbor, by virtue of the fact that there are numerous militant organizations that the country both cannot, because it does lack the capability, and in some cases the lack of political will to completely counter, our interests should be in Pakistan. And so I would argue that what we need is an expedient solution to Afghanistan, i.e., what we want is no support for al-Qaeda. You can resolve your issues with the Taliban. We will focus on mentoring, get out of the kinetics business, because until we are out of Afghanistan, we can't get down to the business of working with our Pakistani colleagues to figure out how to get that country out of the morass that it is currently rooted in. Thank you.